Hey, how's it going, squad? So, we're going to do something a little different today for our video. We're actually going to discuss the state of the meta, but in that retrospect, we're going to actually talk about red and where red has been and where it came from and why it's so good today, and go over mainly the leaders of the last four sets and kind of talk about staples and things like that that kind of fell into play to help it. Um, so most of this we're going to discuss is going to be the newer stuff because a lot of people talk about the red Gogeta, the red Vegito deck, set 2, and then they're also talking about the Super Saiyan 4 Goku and Gogeta deck as well. So those things have been pretty dominant in the meta as of late, and it's becoming to the point where that seems to be what a lot of people are playing now. Do not get me wrong, we can talk about yellow and blue being pretty relevant in the format too, with yellow having the ability to rest and control a lot of the aspects, and blue being able to defend against a lot of the swings that come in from those decks. But when you look at the new Gogeta deck that came out in the profile, when it's turn 1, turn 2, playing, the Secret Rare Super Saiyan 4 Broly and playing the 8-drop Gogeta and just burning you to life on turn 1, 2, down to 1 life, there needs to be some sort of change. And I'm not sure exactly what that is because when you look at it and doing changes, banning cards doesn't necessarily help because it affects the other decks that are playable, but also just straight up banning a leader because of it being really good doesn't really help either because now you got to figure out a new format for that. So you kill a lot of the archetypes for that, and that we kind of saw it with the last ban list that we had when they just banned a lot of the red extra staple cards. But we're gonna get into talking about the deck list, not the deck list, but like decks that were big during the time frame of the set. So first off, we're gonna start with BT14, which is Crossbeards. In that deck, you had the U7 Gohan and then the Jiren. Those decks were really, really good at the time. Jiren had a lot of big hitters and a lot of defense, especially with Violent Larry still being a thing, and then testing the opposition, and just cards along those lines that helped it out a lot during that format. So it did really, really well for a lot of those reasons. And then the other one was the U7 Gohan. Now that one did better because it had a lot of draw and it still had some pretty big hitters and the deck designs were really well. So when you look at those two decks, they did really well and they were pretty dominant in the format. And I think U7 won a lot of the bigger tournaments as well. And they just did really well in the formats because of the draw and the hitters they had. When you go into the next set, Saiyan Showdown, BT15, that deck, there wasn't really much that was added to it. They did have obviously two new leaders for red. They had the Super Saiyan Broly, which was an extra red card deck, and then they had the Sun Goten. The Sun Goten wasn't very dominant. It was just kind of an extra deck that was there. But the Super Saiyan Broly did have some play as well because it had a lot of extra cards that could be played and you could use it for other formats. And Broly's always had support. And it was easy to play big hitters and support your cards and keep them alive long enough to be able to swing big with double strikes and play cards for very little cost at that point. So when they started mixing into the next set, Realm of the Gods, they took a combination of both the draw power and the big hitters and started shoving it into one format. And I think that's where a lot of problems came about. Because the next set, if you look at it, you had the Son Goku Ultra Instincts, otherwise known as Bad Dad No Warp, as my buddy likes to call it. And that deck was just super dominant. You had the ability to pitch a lot of cards. You had the ability to hit the sparking formats for that deck super easy. But also what kind of did it was that you also had the introduction of Unbridled Power or the God Rare. And that card is still, to this day, I think one of the best red secret rares you can run. Because you pay 4, you got a double strike, and if you have the sparking, you have other options to use different things for it. But then the other thing is you can just pitch it right after you're done and burn a life, so it's uninteractable. But with the Warp Coup deck, you literally just pitched cards, and on turn 2, you could play the Android 17, you could play the Frieza, you had a lot of dual attack, a lot of crit, a lot of just combinations that went off, and then you could play the 4-drop Goku as well, that was deflect, dual attack, and double strike, I want to say. I'll post a picture of which one I'm talking about here, and we're going to post pictures of all the leaders too so you guys can see what's going on. But that was the big red deck for that set, and then the other one was the Great Priest. Now that deck is underestimated, I think. It did really well for that stuff. It had a lot of support, and the biggest thing is like it played a lot of different colors, and it gave a lot of formats to that. Now if they give it more support in the future, it still could be a really good deck, but it just wasn't as dominant because when you saw a Warp Coup with how it played and the draw and everything that it had, it just was a more dominant deck at that point. Now, the next set, this is more closer to what we've been playing as of late. Next set was BT17, and that was the Ultimate Squad. That was the release of a lot of the older support for older decks. And with that, we got the support for the Machine Mutant decks. That deck wasn't as potent. There was still a lot of quick play with that, but the meta wasn't keeping up with that. They played the old school stuff and just kind of gave you extra support for that and be able to play those. But the other deck that was a little more dominant in the format was the Kid Goku GT, the red deck with the spaceship. So that deck was pretty dominant because you had a unison that could have 15 markers on it, and you would use Difference of Status as kind of your go-to extra card to hit stuff. And it just had a lot of like negate as well because you could play a lot of the pan blockers and gave it a lot of support that way with also the red staple cards like testing the opposition, and then you had imposing presence, and you still had violent rays. Like you still had a lot of good red support extra cards that could go into it, and then you also mixed in the GT format with the use of the secret rare Hyper Evolution Son Goku, the Super Saiyan 4. You had that you could use, and then it just had a lot of the support from the old GT stuff. So like between having to have a unison that could have a lot of markers and having a lot of support with the GT format and draw ability again and big hitters, it just did really well. I'd have to pull up stats to see how they did in tournaments, but again, I know that these decks have been pretty dominant at that point, and they did really well. The only problems they ran into was that if you ended up playing against red and yellow, or I'm sorry, blue and yellow, yellow had the ability to rest a lot of stuff, so they did stand a chance, but if you could get your stuff going faster than they could, which red does a pretty good job of getting everything going faster, it was hard to counter a lot of that stuff. And then blue, it was kind of the same thing. Blue, again, still had a lot of the walls. They got some pretty good support in the last sets as well to kind of keep up with a lot of things. Not so much in negates, but they just got better leaders and things like that to kind of stay current with the format. But again, they were still having a little bit of struggle. I know I played some of those decks during that time frame. I played a lot of blue decks and a lot of yellow decks because I think the Ultimate Squad had, it was either the Ultimate Squad and the other decks, they just had, like, those sets had good yellow and blue leaders as well. We'll never talk about green or black here because green really hasn't been a thing since you had the green-yellow cell. Granted, you did have the Cell Ultimate deck that came out, and that was around the Ultimate Squad time frame too, and that did really well and is pretty dominant. But like I said, Red just kind of came in and overdid a lot of that stuff. Now, when you look at what we have next after Ultimate Squad, we talk about BT18, Dawn of the Z. So the Dawn of Z Legends, or Dawn of Z I believe it is really focused on the Super Saiyan 4 Goku and Vegeta and Sin. And these decks are just, in my opinion, I think there's too much going on for them. Even with the Aretas and bands that they did have, the Super Saiyan 4 Gogeta deck is just really, really good because when you look at it, you have an unstoppable swing attack that can go through that basically can attack cards that are in rest mode, so you can do a whole board wipe without stopping its attacks and it restands. And then you also have something that can't activate any type of counters or negates or anything in between. So if you can get that far, which you can do pretty easy in the game, turn 3, it works out really well for a lot of stuff. And then with all that support that they did have, it did a really well job. Now people are teching in new things to kind of keep up with the Aretas and bans and changes, but it's still a pretty dominant deck. The other thing about Sin is, sorry, we're going to talk about the Goku Vegeta Super Saiyan 4 deck one more time. It's also super early to awaken, and then they also did introduce the Z leaders too. So the Z leaders didn't really affect this one. I mean, granted, don't get me wrong, it's a 1,001 or 1,000 or 100,000 swing with it, but like most of the times you're relying on your boss monster to finish stuff up, and if you needed to go into the next turn, you had options to cover yourself. When you look at Sin has always been a dominant thing, but it's always been kind of a mix between yellow and then black for a little bit with its warping capabilities. But when you take red Sin and then you start tacking in all the red stuff and make a format where you can literally charge 4 or 5 Z energy with the cracked balls, super easy, and then you start tacking in red support and then you pull in yellow support as well too, it becomes a point of where it's really, really hard to counter a lot of stuff, because now you have almighty resistance when you start running red-yellow, and you also have things like a lot of the yellow support for Sin. Now, don't get me wrong, there's some things you can't run with it, but there are options to do it and mix the colors, and it just works out really well together. And when you're swinging, 25 crit, turn 2, turn 3, and you're swinging a lot of swings, and you're playing a lot of monsters that can do crit or basically go into other monsters, it just becomes an issue. And with the boss monster for Sin, if you try and negate its power or go down on that power, it's going to basically cancel that and then give itself 5k and then do some other fun, quote-unquote, stuff for that. So with these decks, I just think it's really hard to even discuss like what needs to change for them, because I think it's just the archetypes in general and what they're going with red. You also have to remember too, you had the Gogeta Unison, which worked out fantastic for both the decks as well and gave a lot of support to older decks as well. And as you look at that, like, I'm sure we'll see these cards still played and used, and it's just going to be interesting to see where they go forward. So we do have set 19 coming out this week, and we'll see how that plays and changes, but it'll be interesting to see what we need to do for it. So then the last thing that we have is we do have, it's not necessarily a new set, but we do have the anniversary box that they had. And that gave a lot of support to the old stuff. So when you look at this, it gave support to old Red Gogetos and Set 2 Vegito. And with that being said, I made a video about the Set 2 Vegito and been running it for a while. That deck is just really, really good. You can awaken really fast. You can turn to awaken, draw a lot of cards. You have triple strike throughout the deck. You can run the Patara Secret Rare turn 3. It's fantastic, and it works out really well, and it's hard to counter. And even with the Aretas and Bands that they did, it didn't really affect the Vegito set too, because a lot of stuff got limited to it specifically or wasn't really ran in the deck. And when you're running multicolor too, it just works out well for a lot of stuff. So like, that deck right there is really, really good in my opinion. But when you actually look at it, I kind of slept on this a little bit. My buddy didn't. He actually jumped into this, the Gogeta. Okay. When you look at this Gogeta deck, that new Gogeta leader literally pushes the Gogeta decks to the end, and with all like the Union Fusion that support that Gogeta had for Gogeta BR red, it just makes a really, really hard deck. When you're doing turn 1 playing something that can swing for, 35 triple strike or double strike, I think that's a card. I haven't really looked too much into the deck, but I know that you're swinging big turn 1 with double strike, and then you can go straight into Super Saiyan 4 Broly, and you can swing and draw and cycle through stuff. It's just an issue of where, like, to what extent do they start either doing something with changing out the format or giving other support just as good of formats, because you look at it, blue, red, or blue, yellow, green, black, those decks, they do have support, and I'm not saying they don't, but red has just been a dominant format as of late, and it's just really hard to figure out what Bandai wants to do, because it comes down to a point of where, do you want to do rotations and have set deck lists that you run, and then just make people focus on that, and then have an expanded format, and do a standard format and expanded like they do in Magic, where you can run certain cards and do things like that, or what's your plan? Now, I'm not a big fan of doing rotations, because I used to be a big Pokemon player before this, so you guys know, and the reason why I got a Pokemon was because when I was buying decks and buying cards and things like that, it literally came to a point where I would buy cards that were $30, $40, run them, and then I go to tournaments, and then the next year within that time frame, those cards would be out of date. I couldn't use them in the next set that they wanted, or things along those lines, and it became very frustrating because card games, as we know, become very expensive, and it's not a cheap hobby. And I'm not saying that, like, yes, you have to spend money to be good to buy cards that you need, but also when you're spending that much money, you want to be able to use the cards that you have and not have them drop in price point within the next year or two after that. So that's why I'm not necessarily a fan of running into the issue of doing set rotations. But there is something that needs to be done with the meta and the format and how they do stuff, and I'm not really sure what Bandai's plan is, to be honest. Um, so, like, all honesty, that's kind of where you're at. And then, we haven't even talked about the new set, BT19, and even going forward. Like, if you do look at BT19, some of those decks are okay. They do have a lot of the swaps, or the EX Evolve for the Goku and Trunks and Vegeta stuff, and those will be some pretty good tech cards in some of the older decks that are currently out. But again, it just kind of depends on what you guys are looking at. I don't remember the other leader that they have for the red stuff, but again, it's just at what point, Bandai, are you going to sit there and like make other colors just as good and not, you know, make other colors bad? Because green hasn't seen any support. Black is another big one. I know we have the Cumber stuff coming out in set 19, maybe? It might be set 20 because I know I've seen some promos and stuff coming out. But, like, there's support coming out for other colors, but how good are they going to be? Like, Bandai's just had this big thing for red as of late, and it's not, I don't see it changing anytime soon. The community has spoken about a lot of emergency bans, things like that in particular, but you got to remember, people literally will take cards and push them to limits and break them, and that's kind of how you have to play when you play competitive. So if you're trying to play competitive, I'm sorry for all you people right now in the competitive format, because you're going to have to deal with Gogeta. You're going to have to deal with Vegito. You're going to have to deal with the Super Saiyan 4 Gogeta. Like, those are going to be your primary things. You have to find ways around them, and I'm not saying, anything bad about those decks, because they are good decks, but, like, you do need to find ways around them and try and find ways to stop them at that point. A lot of people talking about different cards to help support against the Gogeta that'll basically nullify turn 1, turn 2 swings. It just depends. You really have to sit there and to play competitive, you have to figure out what's going on and start playing around other decks and be creative as well too. And with that, I just wanted to say thank you guys for the support that you guys give me. It really means a lot to me that you guys continue to subscribe, like, and comment, and all that fun stuff. It's sometimes difficult with having kids and finding the time and money and everything like that. So please, if you guys want to see more stuff, let me know. We can always do more stuff. I'm going to try and do some videos of actual gameplay of my Vegito deck so you guys can see that in action. And at the end here, I'm going to tag in that Vegito deck profile as well. That did change. I'll see if I can do an update on it at this point. But again, please, thank you. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this, and follow, like, and subscribe. Thanks. Bye.